Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We are going to be looking at LOMLOE Secondary Ready. So this is the final webinar in our LOMLOE series for this year. So again, thank you for those of you who have attended previous ones. If you have missed the other webinars for whatever reason, there will be a link at the end of today's session where you can find the recordings from the previous sessions. This session will also be recorded. Do feel free to go back, have a look at them. They're on our YouTube channel as well. Lovely. So the plan of action for today is to do a bit of a recap on LOMLOE. Then we're going to look at 3 different classroom activities. We're going to follow a very familiar structure. We're going to look at a warmer activity, a main activity, and then a bit of evaluation at the end. At the end of the session, we're also going to leave a bit of time to have a bit of a Q&A, get a few question and answers for you there.
Yeah.
So, moving on. What is LOMLOE? So, for those of you who are maybe new to LOMLOE, it's the law change in Spain. It's a law that is looking to help improve the standard of education in the country, to try and improve children's rights and access to education. It's looking at trying to improve gender equality in schools, also looking at developing our educational centers, our schools, and also try to start to personalize learning. Following that, there's a focus towards digital. That is not just using technology in the classroom, but also a digital awareness, being able to understand what is and what isn't acceptable, or what we should be doing and be aware of when it comes to using technology. And finally, it is also a bit of encouraging sustainable development as a fundamental part of the educational system. How are we going to do that then? That is the big question, right? So what has been introduced are our key competencies. These are competencies across all subjects. That it means not only English for us, but also maths, science, history, culture, all of the different subjects that children have to do. We'll be focusing on a competence-based system. Obviously, we need to think of ways to be able to teach these in each subject, because it's not the same an English class as a maths class, for example. So what we also have are our specific competencies. These are the language-specific competencies. You've got comprehension, production, interaction, mediation, multilingualism or plurilinguism, and cultural competence. You might notice here. Go on, David. Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say just before we carry on, just in the chat box, can you just note down what the four main skills are?
Yeah. So, what are the 4 main skills that you would be looking at in your classes typically, right?
Yeah. So Lucas straight in there with writing, speaking, listening, and reading.
Excellent.
All completely different: speaking, writing, reading, and listening.
Let's see if we can get a reading, listening, speaking, writing.
I don't give them clues, but they have to be able to do it themselves.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. These are our 4 skills. These haven't disappeared. Of course, these are the foundations of language. There's no way we could teach our subject without them. The only thing is they've been recategorized. Isn't that right, David?
Well, recategorize is probably a slightly difficult, a slightly odd term to use.
Okay.
But if we come to the Common European Framework, the Common European Framework doesn't discuss language in terms of these 4 skills, but they do come across four skills. And I think, unless I'm completely horribly wrong, in the next slide, we've got the, I am completely horribly wrong, aren't I, Mark?
I don't know. What are you going to say?
I don't know. I was going to go for the CFR.
Yeah, no, we're not quite there yet.
We're not there yet. Okay, well, just keep that in mind.
We'll keep it in mind.
And I'll shut up.
So,
sorry about that. I was getting all excited there.
We'll come to it in 1 second. What we have are our comprehension and production skills. So these are our 4 skills, but we also have other areas that we need to be thinking about, which are interaction and mediation. Plurilinguismo or multilingualism is obviously a part of our course already. We teach English to non-native speakers. By nature, we are multilingual, but it is also about encouraging the use or the acknowledgement, more than anything, of local languages as well, or regional languages. And finally, culture is always a part of language learning, isn't it? It's one of the fundamental cornerstones.
You can't teach a language in a vacuum. And also, to come back to plurilinguism, to plurilingualism or multilingualism, this goes right back to one of the ideas which came up in the Council of Europe even before they developed the Common European Framework, which is that every student should be competent in their first language +1. And if they've got a first language +1, so much the better. So they can speak 2 foreign languages, or they speak 2 first languages. Yep. For example, Spanish and Catalan, Spanish and Gallego, and then English or French or whatever added on.
Yeah.
The idea is that as part of being a European citizen, we should be able to speak more than 1 language, which is probably just well that the British have actually left Europe because they were no way ever going to do that.
No. Although I was told once an interesting fact that actually in England, over 1/3 of the population speak more than 1 language. Yeah, but it takes into account also foreign nationals who have come to England who live from abroad. So it's not a true fact, really. It's a it's
just slightly misleading, shall we say.
Exactly. So one of the other key points you'll notice here is mediation. Mediation is important, and it might be maybe a new term to some of you, but it is something that has existed in our classrooms for many, many years, and you'll recognize it once we start to describe it. It is the other part of language learning where we have reception, production, reception, listening, reading, production, speaking, writing. Then we have interaction, or we could call it collaboration. And then there's mediation. Mediation is not so much working together, but taking language from one point and describing or using it in another point.
Yeah, this was actually the slide I was referring to.
Oh, okay. Fantastic.
And this basically the idea is the Common European Framework talks about 4 skills, 4 language skills, but they don't talk necessarily about reading, writing, speaking, and listening. They join those together in reception. As Mark said, reception would be reading and listening. Production would be speaking and writing. However, there are different functions within production. So, for example, at the moment, I am not interacting. I'm just talking on. So I'm exposing or just basically talking or delivering a lecture. But there is the other possibility where we use language as a social tool to interact and to communicate between different people, and therefore there is interaction. And interestingly, many times that's actually described as a 5th skill. If we're talking about reading, writing, speaking, and listening, there's the 5th skill of interaction, which can be written interaction or it can be spoken interaction. And although the Common European Framework always spoke about mediation, in the 2018 Companion volume, they emphasized the role of mediation within the communicative framework, as it were, which we can say that this is. A mediation is basically taking a middle position between reception and production. So it's taking something which is produced, either written or spoken, and transposing it into a format which can be received correctly and successfully by the receivers. So it's not necessarily even in one language. It can be between languages, or it can be within the same language.
For sure. I mean, it almost what it does act as a tool for multilingualism. We can take from one language, let's say your local language is Valenciano. You can then take it and transfer it to English, or vice versa, from English to your local language, Gallego, for example. It can be used as a tool. It can also be used as a tool for culture. You can take one piece of information about culture and then transfer it and explain it to another point. Yeah. It's taking information, summarizing it, and moving it forward.
Yeah. So or speaking to children, explaining to something in a different way in order to make it accessible to the receiver. Excellent.
So on that note, what we've got here, obviously, are our 4 of our 6 competencies.
Yeah.
The other 2, multilingualism and culture, are very much vehicles to help support the learning here. And that leads us on to why should we assess competencies?
Yeah, that's a really good point. For many years, we've been focusing on evaluating or assessing a product. So we have a final product, a final something which the students have produced, and that's what we would measure. We would measure it against all sorts of different scales which we may develop, but we would normally we would focus on measuring the end result. So students work all month or all term on different things in the classroom, and then we give them an exam at the end, and the exam is the assessment, and it's the assessment of the end product of what they've done, rather than watching what they're doing as they grow. If we start to assess competences, then we are always looking at where a student is strong and where they need to improve at whatever point in time. So it can be assessed on an ongoing basis through the term. That would tend to allow your students, it would give your students more feedback during the course of their learning, and it would allow them to improve and to seek help where they need help and demonstrate progress. So rather than getting to the end of term and then saying, actually, sorry, you only got a 4, so you're a total failure. Maybe at the beginning of the term, they have certain weaknesses which we identify, and they can identify through the competencies, and then they can work on those. It's not a question of knowledge. A competence is an ability, and an ability you can train. And as we are giving them feedback on their competence development, then they can train what they need to train, and we can help them with that training. And also, obviously, the more information we get during the course of their learning and watching their learning can help us to model our future learning activities much more carefully. So first of all, we can design the exam at the end of the term much more carefully. We can design how we're going to mark them, not just on the exam. Maybe we'll give them part of the marks as sort of progress through the term, but also we know what we need to cover next term in order to make sure that they're not left with any gaps or any holes in their learning. So it's a constant, continuous feedback loop. Yep. We've got information coming in, and we use that information to plan our next steps. Yes. And because we're training skills rather than concepts, or rather than content, they can come at that skill in different ways. They may not be able to produce some content, but they'll show ability.
Yeah. What's a really nice thing with competencies as well is that we can be much more positive and focus on success.
Yeah.
And that is really fundamental to learning. Success creates motivation, motivation creates engagement, engagement creates learning. It's very much a powerful tool, and that's one of the reasons why we look at assessing it, not just developing it but assessing it.
Yeah.
Which leads us to the why is great, but how do we assess them?
Yeah, well, I think I've partly covered this, because as I say, quite often we're assessing a language, we're often focusing on a product. But particularly when we're learning a language, as language teachers, we can recognize that there's this massive sort of hinterland between being completely successful in a language and being not knowing the language at all. Actually, it's the other way around, obviously, because hopefully our students aren't going backwards. But if we are measuring language progress as in terms of product, they are going to feel like they are failures for much of their school career and much of their learning career. Whereas if we can make them understand that their skills and their competencies, although they're not perfect, are improving, they can start to see that development. They will understand that they are actually growing and improving, although they may not be able to do everything they want to do with the language. So what we're encouraging them to see is language learning as a journey in which they're taking small steps rather than going from not being able to do something to being able to do something. So really what we're looking at is the process of learning rather than the product.
Yeah. And
that ties in very much with the idea of a communicative approach, the idea of it's a pity Victoria isn't here, because I feel the need to drop in holiday and language as a social semiotic. Apologies for that. I just, every now and again, I have to say it because it's wonderful.
Get it off your chest.
Yeah, I just have to get it out. No, the idea is that the fundamental reason for using language is to communicate, and communication can happen with non-perfect language. And in fact, quite a lot of our time learning a language, we must communicate using less than perfect language. We will make mistakes. We will have difficulties in expressing ourselves, but we'll get our ideas across. And as we develop, so we'll get our ideas across more effectively and more efficiently. But we can still make mistakes.
Yep.
I had a student who was studying C1 advanced, and he still said city rather than city. Everything else that he said was pretty much comprehensible, but he had those problems.
Yeah. If you ever listen to me speak in Spanish, my accent is terrible, but I do feel I can communicate more or less, it's very much that it's about the communication, right? So anyway, so what is it? Then it is about the process. Product is, of course, important. We do need to have some final proof and evidence, for sure. That's really important. But it's also more about not just focusing on that final product. It's about the process. And that's where competencies tend to appear. So moving on now to some of those activity ideas that we've mentioned earlier. We've got a question for you. We're going to imagine that it is now September. We are starting our new year with LOMLOE in full force. How are we going to support Primero de ESO when they join the school? So these are new kids who have just joined secondary school. How might we support them? What ideas do you have there? If you'd like to share in the chat box, what could we do? We're talking more about classroom here, more about how we could support them in the English classroom as opposed to joining the school. So any ideas on how you might support your learners?
Perhaps you already have reception ideas in place, actually. So induction to the new school, induction to the ways that we're working.
Yeah.
I know that some schools, even the people from secondary actually visit the primary schools. So there's a sort of day where either the primary school kids go to the secondary school and spend a day there and have a look around, or the teachers, some of the teachers from secondary go to the primary school, so that it's not completely new when they come in September.
I remember when I was at school in England that we did mentoring, and you would go to your primary school and you would have a group of 5 students you would bring up to the school, and they could come to you and ask you where the classes were and all those types of things.
That's great. That's really good.
Okay, no one's sharing any ideas. I guess you're racking your brains. We're going to go through a suggestion then. Okay, so what we're going to do is to show you a run of activities, and then we're going to look at how they are beneficial when it comes to LOMLOE. So here is okay, Christine just shared one. Build teacher and student rapport. Make the students feel comfortable and safe. That's a really nice and important one. Yeah, rapport is fundamental, I think, in a lot of classes. Don't make them feel like they belong, which is one of my favorite words at the moment. Making them feel a part of the learning environment.
Yeah. So this activity is looking mainly at creating classroom rules or classroom practices. And it's a really useful way of starting the year, because that way you're creating expectations for the rest of the year, and creating ways in which they can work. And as Christine says, creating a comfortable and safe environment within the classroom. Very few students learn in a classroom which is antagonistic, or in a classroom where they feel threatened. You never give your best if you feel threatened. So you must, sorry, it sounds like I'm dictating here. It's really important to develop a classroom culture where students feel safe. They feel safe to create, or safe to make mistakes. They feel safe to work together. They feel safe to take risks within their learning. So here we've got a simple exercise taken from a textbook, where we have a series of things. So we've got listen to your partner, answer your partner's questions, speak at the same time as your partner, help your partner with words they don't know, laugh at your partner's mistakes, ask questions to get more information. So here, what we need to do is to decide which of these are positive activities when working together, and which of these are negative activities, or which things should be avoided when working together. And if there are negative points, let's find some strategies to be able to help us to work through that.
Yeah. And really important when we introduce activities like this is the follow-up stage, where we take this idea and we create our class rules, personalizing it, bring it into the classroom, make it a reality for our kids, right? If you look at the bottom activity here, the last one here is we would like the teacher to. That's always a really, really nice one, because that involves us, that helps build rapport with our learners. It's not just I expect from you, it's what you expect from me as well. It demonstrates the relationship.
Yeah, and every class is different as well. Every class culture is different. So as teachers, it's very easy to go into different classes during the course of the day and have the same approach, the same attitude, and sometimes it works with one class, but it doesn't work with others. If we start the year by asking our students, what do you want from me? First of all, it shows them that they've got a place, they've got a voice, and they can ask for what they need. They can approach you, and it also helps you to differentiate between different classes, because not every class is the same.
Yeah. Another thing that we can then do once we've established rules is start to a bit of interaction. Give them a few questions like this. Ask and answer with a partner. Have you got a notebook? Is it all for your subjects? Are your notes easy or difficult to read? If we jump ahead, nice, when we do little activities like this, it's nice to get them to work by themselves first, then with a partner, get their ideas down, and then as a group. So we could give each group a different color pen. They come to the board, they write it on the board, and we create a visual for the room. We make these things not just personal, we make it a part of the group. Why would we do that? Because then we can move on to an activity like this, where they start to look at good notes or notebooks and say, what's a good note? What do you like? What isn't a good note? You know, what are some other ways to organize your notebook? Which is your favorite way and why? We're starting to build a platform for them. Maybe some of them come and their English isn't the best, or maybe their note taking isn't great, or maybe they haven't developed the necessary skills for secondary yet, or they haven't got a good foundation. So little activities like this are really important. In fact, if you look at the CEFR for mediation, we'll look at it a bit later on, but one of the points in that is note-taking. Mm. That is a really important part of the school experience and the learning experience.
Again, it's transforming information from one form to another. Mm-hmm. But obviously they need to transform it into something which works for them. Exactly. Notice also that there's nothing here about what don't you like about this this notebook. It's always positively framed. So what's good about Amar's notebook? What is good about Azra's? I mean, there are other ways to organize a notebook. How do you organize your notebook? Are you more like Azra? Are you more like Amar? Yep. What can we draw from this? What can we take from this?
It's the positive aspect, isn't it? And what's really nice is you are creating a sense of comfort. You know, there's not a wrong answer. It's okay, I prefer this. That's not a bad thing. You know, I can like something different to someone else, and it doesn't mean that we don't have to be friends because they're still young kids, right?
Yeah.
It's really important.
Yeah. But also, I mean, I think they're again getting a voice into how they're going to organize their work during the year. Mm-hmm. I mean, quite a lot of teachers, I know I've been guilty of this. You go in and you say, okay, here's your English notebook. This is how I want it organized. I want this, this, and this. Whereas if we talk it through with them, we get much more buy-in from them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and we can encourage them. It's something we can value in their English language learning because it is an important part of learning any subject. Right, so once they've done this, they've decided their different things, they can then discuss how they are going to organize their notebook. They're going to write a checklist of things they're going to include, and then they're going to start to record their notes. You know, also, maybe we could encourage them to add a bit of a reflection in their notebooks as well. What did I do well this lesson? I worked well in my group or with my partner because I think I could be better at. It's positive reinforcement. Where can I improve? We're trying to encourage them to become more autonomous learners and be more aware of their own performance. Again,
that's just so important. Getting students to reflect on a regular basis on what they're doing and giving them a space to do it and a way of doing it. So scaffolding it.
Yeah.
And they keep that journal and they can refer back to what they were doing. And that again helps them to see that progress, which we were talking about before. That's a progress in competence.
Yeah, and another point to mention is that it's consistent. If we have it as a part of our notebook taking habit, it becomes a consistent habit. What is a consistent habit? It's more likely to have an impact. If it's something you do every now and then, well, it's kind of a bit of a what's the point? You know, if we have a consistent way of doing it, it has more chance to be a success. Yeah. So we just looked at 4 different activity ideas. In the chat box, would you like to share what competencies do you think were demonstrated? On the right, you have your LOMLOE competencies: linguistic communication, multilingual, STEM, digital, personal, social, learning to learn, citizenship, entrepreneurship, and cultural awareness. I don't know why I read it. I'm sure you can read it, but
filling in the space while they're typing.
Exactly, that's what I was doing.
I love the idea. I think entrepreneurship, they could sell notebooks to other people. For a small price, I will prepare your notebook for you.
Yeah. But
Maybe don't tell your students that.
Yeah, entrepreneurship is quite an interesting one as well, because well, I'll explain in a second as well in a bit more detail, but entrepreneurship, when you read about it in the law, it talks a lot about critical thinking and creative thinking. It's kind of in a more modern, I suppose, in a more
so it's sort of thinking outside the box type thing, which is going to lead you to be able to create something new as an entrepreneur would within the business world. That's really interesting.
It's a fascinating idea. Obviously, it has its base in entrepreneurship, but it is when you look at it, there's a lot of critical thinking and creative thinking, and that's very easy when we think of it in that concept as creative and critical. As teachers, it was even mentioned as one of the important things, I think.
Yes,
Raffaella
said. Raffaella, yeah.
So it's something that we are aware of and we include in our classes. Well, that's where it appears in the LOMLOE. It's within entrepreneurship. So Excellent. Does anyone want to suggest any ideas? Oh, nice, Christine. Thank you very much. C1, C5, C8. Lucas, C1, C2.
If they're able to use the native tongue, yes. C2 is multilingual competence. If we allow the use of like L1 in the classroom. Yeah, there's loads. I mean, Sacramento has said C1, C4, and C5. Yeah, digital, there's potential there, and C5, personal, social, learning to learn. I think that's a strong guess as well. Yeah, so it seems C1 and C5 were mentioned by everybody, so we could go with those. I think if we jump ahead, I think we also said C5 and C1. Yep. So those were the two that we felt were most likely. But again, it all depends on how you structure the activities, on the things you're structuring in your class. Now, for us as teachers, how do I evaluate that? How do I think about success? How do I help my learners achieve what is C5 and C1? Well, for those of you who use Cambridge materials, you may be familiar with the Cambridge Life Competencies framework. What we've done is we have started to map that to LOMLOE as well. So there are certain things and criteria that match over. We've just highlighted here 4 examples of relevant success criteria, I suppose. Explicit success criteria, isn't it? Yeah.
For these activities. I'll show you in a bit more detail the actual framework. So here's the framework. We've got learning to learn and communication, which are the same as we saw in LOMLOE, using effective strategies for learning and retaining information. We've done that. Evaluating learning and progress. Excuse me, I had to sneeze off mic. Using communication strategies to facilitate conversations, and using appropriate language and presentation styles with confidence and fluency. So we have actual criteria there that we can go, did they achieve this? Well, yes, they did. And how well did they do it? Well, then that's down to us on how we want to grade them. But this framework provides a really nice structure for us as teachers to look at our classes from a competence point of view and think about how our learners are performing in that classroom. Yeah. Anything you'd like to add before we move on, David?
No, I think that's pretty clear. I think these any time where we're using a rubric, it's really useful to be able to evaluate, to assess. Yeah. Speaking of rubrics, if you hang around for later in this webinar, we will be showing you some resources that have been put together. Rubric being one of them. Okay, so nice. So that's kind of like the first round of activities. We can, at the beginning of the year, we can start to help them by encouraging them to be aware of different learning strategies. By being aware of different learning strategies, we're also creating a good foundation for them. And this doesn't just have to be Primero de Yeso either, let's be honest. We could do that with all years. But we've got a good foundation that we can effectively monitor throughout the year. Again, looking at the process rather than just the final product. Would also like to quickly mention this, having notebook, taking your notes is often already something that is monitored in classes.
now it's just having another way to reward our learners, be positive about it. Nice. So let's move on and have a look at reading activity. We've got a couple of reading texts here. What activities might you do with a reading text like this? Does anyone want to share any ideas in the chat box? So we've got a couple of inspiring women with disabilities. Yeah, that's good. Concept checking questions to check comprehension. Highlight tenses, verbs, nice. Interact with the language being used in the text. It's always a useful tool for the learner. In fact, we've covered two great bases there. We've covered concept and content, and we've also covered the language. Given the answer, write the question in pairs. That's fun. Okay, nice. Yeah, so there are 101 activities we could do with these, really, aren't there? We're going to run through a series of activities with you, and then we'll do same process as before. So here's a nice one again. Each partner takes one text, so we give each partner a different text. They each fill out a mind map with the information from their person. So for example, if I go back, maybe I have Francesca and David has Beatrice. And I fill out my information with Francesca and David his with Beatrice. Now I will go and find someone else who has the same person as me, and I will check with them. I will see, oh, what information did you put? Oh yeah, I put this as well. And I start to double check and confirm my information, and David does the same thing. Mm-hmm. Once we've completed this mingling activity, we can then go and find someone who has the other person. So then I would go to David and I would tell him about my person, about Francesca, and he and I would compare the information that we've collected. We can maybe answer a few questions here. So we're taking information, we're summarizing it, we're putting it into an easier to digest form, and then we're going and talking about it with someone.
Yeah, and this at the same time they're learning to skim and to scan, mm-hmm. To get a general idea of the text and to find the specific information that they're looking for, mm-hmm. And then they're checking it with somebody else, so they're clear that they've got it right before they go off and do the second part of the activity. It's really important to give them that support. They don't sort of launch off and then find that they've got their answers wrong. And then they can make a mess of the next activity. The error feeds into the following activity. Make sure that they check one activity and then go on and do the next one.
Yeah, and another really nice thing is they can check that their content is similar or right, or yeah, it meets the needs of the activity, but more so they also get to rehearse and they get to practice talking about their person, and that rehearsal builds confidence, and when we have more confidence we're going to participate more. So it's about building up a sense of
security, almost.
Security, yeah, in their ability in the language to talk about their person. So that's a really short activity. We've taken two reading texts, we've done a mingling, and then we've gone on and done a sharing activity. What types of competencies do you think we are practicing with this task? If you would like to share in the chat box. I think now C1, C5, is that a new one or is that the previous one?
No, it's a new one.
New one, C1, C5, C8, C1, C2, C5. Good. Anyone else want to share? So it seems linguistic communication is pretty strong. Personal, social, and learning to learn again is pretty strong.
I like the C8 actually, the idea that it's cultural awareness and expression. Because of the content of the texts, to some extent, we're building in cultural awareness into the activity, because we're reading about a certain type of thing, so we become aware of something which maybe we weren't aware of before. But at the same time, our students are learning about what is an appropriate way of expressing, for example. So this is appropriate expression. The way that we write about, or the way that we put a text together. Because we're exposing them to a text, they're learning what a text looks like. To some extent.
Citizenship was also brought up there by Sacramento, which is a nice one as well. Great. So let's show you what we thought. We are more or less in line with everybody there. Yeah, communication, personal, social, learning to learn, citizenship, and entrepreneurship. So why might we say entrepreneurship here? I think this comes back to the critical thinking as well, and the creative thinking. It's taking information, it's processing it, and it's identifying and getting them to think critically about the text, categorizing and extracting specific information such as nationality, disability, jobs, achievement, etc. Again, the same. This is all very nice, but we need a bit of structure to try and think about this. Well, our Cambridge Life Competencies framework can help us. We've identified 4 different areas here: contributing to a task, listening, responding respectfully, engaging and supporting others, and identifying and classifying information. If I show you them in situ, you have the critical thinking, communication, and collaboration here. Again, collaboration, we haven't mentioned it, but it is interaction, isn't it? So that's obviously there. By nature, I think I think every activity in the English language classroom has to be communicative in some way, shape, or form. We're always sort of working towards communication. So that's going to be everywhere. We don't have a problem with that. But also critical thinking, as was mentioned earlier as well. That is another key part and a key element of a classroom. In this case, we identified and classified information, and we interpreted and drew inferences from an argument. So we interpreted a text, didn't we? And the content within it. If we think about this also from a slightly further away point of view, what we're sorry, I've jumped ahead. There's me skipping ahead. When it comes to evaluating in these types of activities, what we could do is get them to do a self-assessment grid like this, where they quickly answer, well, not quickly, maybe, but they answer 3 key questions, like what was difficult to say? Can you say why it's important to listen, share, and be kind to people in this text? And can you say what you're getting better at in English in this case? We want them, we've given them structure. It was difficult to say. It's important to listen, share, and be kind because I'm getting better at. We're structuring them, trying to help them be able to recognize and to be positive. You know, the self-assessment is also really nice for us because it also helps us be aware. For example, with the first question, what are they finding difficult? What are they struggling with? We can start to pay attention to that and be aware. And when we're aware, we can start to plan for the future. What I was going to say before this was what we have been doing in this type of task is a mediation activity. Okay, so really, if you look at this grid, there are 5 different points: mediating a text, concepts, and communication. And then there are strategies to explain and simplify. What we were going to ask you to do quickly is identify on this grid, what do you think we were doing in this activity? So the activity of the 2 texts, filling out the brainstorm, sharing with a partner. Again, share in the chat box if you can highlight any that you feel we were working on. For those of you who maybe aren't so familiar with mediation or haven't seen this grid before, please do check out our previous webinars on mediation. We had a mediation for primary and mediation for secondary. Victoria helped us out with those and gave some really, really great insights into mediation in the classroom. As I mentioned,
so I think in different parts of this activity, we're probably doing different mediation activities. So I think maybe you need to identify what we were doing or which part of the activity you're thinking about. So, for example, when we were reading the text, what were we doing?
Yeah, Christine, strategies to simplify the text. Nice. Anyone else want to share an idea? We'll leave that one running on if people want to share. But managing interaction is a nice one as well.
Yeah,
definitely.
And that I think is what we were talking about. So we've got mediating. We mediate the text when we're dealing with the text, but we're also mediating concepts and possibly mediating communication at the same time. So we may be doing all of the three. Within those three, yes, we're mediating. We're collaborating in a group because we're working together to extract meaning. And we're also managing an interaction.
Yeah. If we're honest, we could probably, on some level, link it to most of them.
Yeah.
You know, the ones that we identified here were relaying specific information, explaining data or explaining the text, and processing the text. Why? Well, if we look at relaying, this is from the Common European Framework. For reference, we've got the descriptors for mediation, relaying specific information. At B1 can relay content of public announcements, detailed instructions, or specific information given in informational text. To justify that as an informational text, it was an article about an athlete. You know, what we're doing is basically developing specific skills that are easily identifiable. You know, this framework, this grid really helps us identify what we're doing. Again, I'll show you the next one, explaining data. Can describe in simple sentences facts or information given. So it's talking about this person, their achievements, their goals, medals won, their etc., etc. You know, they're extracting information and they're able to talk about it. Moving on, we've also got processing a text. They're summarizing, they're reducing, they're collating short pieces of information. They're really working on a different level. Now, this is really useful because it allows us to identify their language performance, their linguistic performance, without saying, oh, you spelled this wrong, you didn't use the right grammar, you didn't use the right tense. We're looking at their ability to use the language. And that is also really fundamental because this is something we could do throughout the year. I don't know if you've ever had kids who are really good in class, they contribute, but then when it comes to the end of term tests, they're not the strongest learners, they don't get the best marks. Well, we can reward them for their effort throughout the year and their success throughout the year by identifying things like this. And that leads us on to the final stage, the final activity.
Okay, and conscious of time, I would throw out, do you ever do projects with your students? Excuse quick yes or no. Because here we're going to start looking at sort of using a project as a way of teaching and developing and assessing competences.
Mm-hmm.
So do you ever work on projects with your students?
Yeah.
So I know there are different opinions. There was a big drive towards project-based learning in Spain a few years ago when I was still teaching. It was so about 9 years ago. A lot of people started talking about project-based learning as the way forward. It's as good as anything. It's only as good as what you do with it. So if you just say, okay, go off and do a project on this, it's not going to work, and they're not going to learn. But if you develop the project and work with them, then you can get really good results, and they learn a huge amount, and it's much more significant learning for them because they've discovered things, they've found things out. They haven't just been spoon-fed.
So looking at this project, do you think you could identify some competencies that we might be covering? So just have a look at the 5 stages. Collaboration, yeah, interactions there. I'll give you a few more seconds to share a few ideas before I start to give you our suggestions.
Hello, Anna. Nice to see you here. We have been infiltrated.
Okay, I'll give you the next slide. So here on the screen, what you can see are, oh, fantastic. Thank you, Christine.
One of each.
Yeah, just take your pick. What do you want? I think you pretty much nailed it there. It's definitely C1, isn't it? There's definitely a multilingual element we could include.
Yeah.
3, 4, it's because it's all in there. I mean, this activity here is actually one that we've prepared. These are available to users of our courses. As of next year, you'll be able to see that this final project, this learning situation or situación de aprendizaje, clearly identifies the different areas we're focusing on. But it's what you're saying, Agnieszka, it's basically all of them.
Yeah.
And this is a guideline. You could probably extend this project and add in even more. You know,
yeah. This is a nice guideline into a project as well for you. If you're setting up a project for yourself, think about the competences that you want to bring in. So obviously I want my students to demonstrate competence in linguistic communication, but I almost certainly want them to work together and develop personal, social, and learning to learn skills. I want them to develop critical thinking, so that brings in entrepreneurship. I want them to, because I'm working on a project, let's make it a culturally aware project. You know, we usually end up with the environment or whatever. And that is developing cultural awareness and expression. We would almost certainly want to have a digital element in it these days. If only they're going to search on the internet, they're going to find information on the internet. They may be producing the finished product digitally rather than on paper or on a poster. So they might be using one of these online magazine production tools which you can use and produce a magazine which is online, and you can on the screen turn the pages. And why not involve maths? Why not involve science and technology? As well as we have to have a subject for our learning situation, for our project.
Yeah.
So let's talk with our maybe maths colleagues or science colleagues and work on something together.
Yeah, that's a really nice point to make, because another thing that we can see within LOMLOE is because we do have a structure integrated across all subjects, which are these competencies. We have opportunities to join subjects and apply knowledge. Also, when it comes to things like science, maybe science, it's not so much about mathematics or science. We could also think about mathematical thought and scientific thought, hypothesizing, testing, concluding. You know, there's so many different ways we can integrate it. But the real challenge, I feel at least, is in a project like this, there's so much going on. There's so many competencies. How do we manage it? You know, how do we, as teachers and as our learners, how do we keep track of what we're actually doing and what we're actually achieving when it comes to competencies? For that, we've actually also produced and provided some grids like these. These are sub-skills logs. What these do, they allow us to, allow our learners to have a perspective on what they're achieving. It also helps them think ahead on what they're going to try and achieve for each project. Again, because there's so many things going on, it allows us to have some form of structure to actively progress through, as opposed to just completing the task without really knowing why. And also, it's a platform for them to reflect, which again, as David mentioned earlier, is really, really important, and something that maybe we don't dedicate as much time to as we probably should. On that note, though, we also have a competency log. So this is really useful for us as teachers, just as much as the learners, to identify the different competencies so that they can say, well, yes, I was communicative. How was I communicative? Here's an example. How could I improve it next time? We're encouraging our learners to take an active role in their education, select what they believe they did well and how they demonstrated it, and then share it with us as teachers. Which also, when it comes to reviewing, you can ask your learners to complete these types of activities, then they hand them in to us and we can go through and say, well, yes, Pepe, you were communicative like this, and I do think this. Maybe you could also do this to improve next time. You know, we can be positive and we can encourage them to take responsibility and recognize success, which again creates an engagement in the classroom through them feeling like they're a part of the group.
Yeah, by the way, it's really, really important when they do that reflection and say, how can I improve next time, that they are very, very concrete. So many times they say, oh yeah, I'm just going to speak better next time.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Yeah. You know, how are you going to speak better? What are you going to focus on? Yeah. Drill down into really what they mean. So, because if they get away with, or they write in some sort of very vague proposal for next time, they can never measure it or decide whether they've actually done it or not. So it doesn't give them any structure for next time.
Yeah. And the final point there is it's the deeper insights into learners' perspectives. If you also think about it, how often do we really know what the learners are feeling or what they feel they did well? Maybe they felt they did really well in something, and unknowingly we've made a comment to them and we said, oh, you could do that better. And that's going to really damage a child's self-efficacy, isn't it? Their belief in themselves, because they thought they'd done well, but we'd criticized them for it. So allowing them to take the responsibility and share their success is a really nice point. The final resource and tool that we have at our disposal, as I mentioned earlier on, is this rubric. It's a competence and sub-skill table. This allows us a fair system to evaluate the learner. It also allows us to create a record of achievement. And it also gives us a structure for us to go away and think about how we can prepare our lessons. We can look for the opportunities to evaluate these throughout the year in the process, as opposed to the product. We can identify sub-skills in the different competencies as a way of as a way of, I've lost my train of thought, of creating structure for our evaluation. Yeah.
Well done.
Thank you. Thank you. Again, not just these resources, all of the activities and resources you've seen throughout this session are actually a part of the Cambridge LOMLOE pack that you'll find with your courses as of September. So you'll have access to all of these plus more evaluation tools, posters as such, like this one here. These help our learners become aware. These are things we can print off and put on the wall. They help them understand what's important. And also, as we've seen earlier, it helps create a sense of group, the group dynamics, and also being inclusive. We all working together, we all have our own journey to travel along, and we all have our future goal. So there's lovely posters like this. This is just one example. I'll show you in a second some more. But if you want to find out more about these things, you can go to our website. If you go to cambridge.es, and you'll see there on the home screen, LOMLOE ready. Click there and you'll dive straight in. Here we go. Here are some of the other resources. So for next year, you're going to have learning situations evaluation pack. So you saw an example of that with the project. All of those resources you saw with the project come here. We also have competencies books and practices. There's activity banks for primary. So we've got lots of resources being made available for September for users, Cambridge, people who are using our books, sorry. Here's a few more examples of the posters. So we've got things like routines and different foods in different languages. We've got this like multilingual, really, really nice tools and materials appearing over the place at the moment. A lot of the activities you saw today are also part of the activity cards pack. So these cards, there are 60 for primary, 60 for secondary. They are the Cambridge Life Competencies Framework section, so collaboration, communication, learning to learn, etc. But on each card, it identifies the different LOMLOE competency that is being developed. So we also have a really clear way to identify multilingual competence, and we have an activity that we can do and say to our learners, we're working on this. Do you think you did it well? They can then reflect and go into thinking about how they demonstrated that competence. So loads and loads of tools appearing. Of course, if you want to know more about any of the resources you've seen throughout these webinars, if you want to find out a bit more about the tools, get in touch with your local Cambridge representative. We've got courses that are coming out with LOMLOE ready resources all integrated in them. And that is pretty much it for today. If you have any questions, do start writing them up in the chat box. We've got a few minutes now just to answer any final questions. But while you're writing your questions, I would like to just say, please don't miss our next webinars.